Hola, buen día, buenos días. Por favor, si quieren ir ocupando sus asientos en la... Buenos días, por favor.
To take a seat. Sí, por lo que tengo aquí, empieza sí. Y luego las intervenciones. Aquí. Buenos días.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Once again, we are going to start the opening session of our conference for the University of Barcelona. It's a great pleasure to welcome you at home and also to start this conference within a long and complicated week, which is also full of events which are related to higher education. To be able to dedicate the space of time to lifelong learning, as you can imagine, it's something which is not irrelevant at all. The conditions under recently the university activity has generated a different framework, different from the one we were used to for the last 30 years, has given place to a scenario where lifelong learning has become a crucial unavoidable axis of what we understand when we speak about higher education. If 30 years, which would be the framework of the update of knowledge and the challenges that the future has ahead of us, will have been a very dystopic way of thinking. But reality and this is something nobody will question. So to start this week with a conference dedicated to lifelong learning is, of course, necessary. So without further ado, we are going to open this session. We're going to take a look at the agenda. We are going to ask Dr. Raúl Ramos, Vice Rector. Thank you very much for your presence. Vice Rector, please. Yes, good morning, everybody. Members of the opening session and those of us together with us in internet. We're going to follow the following order. I'm going to introduce each one of the speakers in a way. My first speaker, our first speaker, who is Miss Vanessa Jacenton, and Vanessa Devia-Centon was not able to be here with us, but she will be able to be with us through connection that we're starting now. She's Deputy Director of Higher Education at the General Direction of Youth, Sports and Culture of the European Commission. Therefore, this is a basic direction for the definition of the different European policies, reforms and transformation in the field of higher education, which is quite a recent initiative, which includes European universities, the recognition of higher education qualifications, or the creation of the student card of the European Union. Before, Ms. Tibes was responsible for the General Direction of Research and Innovation. So good morning, Mrs. Tibes, and please go ahead.
So good morning.
Good morning, everyone. For me,
Placer
to
para
join
mí
you to discuss
el
lifelong learning today. Indeed, the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and the digital and green transitions have accelerated the pace of change in how we live, how we learn, how we do research, and how we work. These changes trigger the need for a group anyone in Europe can access quality education and training throughout their lives to develop their personal, social, cultural, and professional competencies. These learning opportunities should be offered in a flexible, learner-centered, accessible, and inclusive ways in order to enable a wide range of people, regardless of their age or personal situations. We know that many of them are looking for short courses to develop the specific skills that they need in a just-in-time format. Such opportunities are developing and offered by a wide range of providers and can lead to micro-credentials. An important objective of the European Strategy for Universities presented in January this year is precisely to support higher education institutions in cooperation with the labour market in making lifelong learning a reality in Europe and to enable people of all ages to acquire and improve through their lives the knowledge, skills, and competencies that they need to thrive in an evolving labour market and society. In this context, the Commission has proposed a European approach to micro-credentials presented in December last year and currently discussed with the Council of the EU. We expect the Council recommendation on micro-credentials to be adopted in June this year. So I'll be happy to provide more information in a moment, and I'm looking forward to the discussions today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these initial words. I'm sure that later on we'll have time for this interesting discussion. Permítanme pasar, por tanto,
So let me now go to introduce the following speaker of our opening table. I'm thinking about Mr. Juan Romo, President of the CRUE since the 26th of April 2022. Therefore, this is one of the first public conferences in which he's participating as president. We would like to congratulate him and welcome him. He's the rector of the University Carlos III de Madrid since March 2005, and he's an expert in mathematical sciences, where he has experience as a researcher, a very wide experience. So thank you very much for being with us, Mr. Romo, and whenever you want. Thank you very much, and thank you for welcoming me to this conference on universities and lifelong learning. This lifelong learning is an opportunity, and it's an opportunity in a double sense. One opportunity for those who need to train again. Knowledge advances at an exponential pace, but also the skills required in our day-to-day job move forward very quickly, and they transform very quickly, and people need to be given the opportunity to learn once again. And I say that lifelong learning, it's a double opportunity because it's also an opportunity for universities. To date, those who study and finish university by the age of 22, 23, 24, 25, if they study a master, or a bit longer if they finish doctorate or a PhD. If they want to go back to studying during their lifelong process, this opens a university, an opportunity, for universities, because we can rethink the way we transmit knowledge and the framework and the format under which we do it. It's a very rigid one, and lifelong learning will allow us to open new possibilities and new ways to provide knowledge. We can introduce micro-credentials. We can also eliminate continuous trajectories or lines in training, so training could be completely tailored so people can learn according to a specific menu designed by them. Way, for example, like personalized medicine, we are advancing towards a personalized lifelong learning. Lifelong learning, continuation, knowledge, new skills, motivations, and more possibilities of promotion. More specialized learning and completely updated allows them to respond in a much more efficient way to the needs and changes in the environment, which is translated in a higher competitivity and efficiency. The social role fulfilled by this learning format as an engine of progress has to be covered by universities through an open, flexible and updated offer. All this without giving up to the different demands of quality, because quality is a key factor for the competitiveness of our profession. So this is the reason why from European campuses we are making a very clear effort lifelong training. Example of this perspective of universities for lifelong learning are the MOOCs, massive open line courses, which are very appropriate formats that have to be used for continuous learning because they provide two advantages. Tailor-made learning, allowing us to be trained in a very specific area without having to complete a course related to a traditional degree, and also the cost, not only understood from an economic perspective, but also time-saving to carry out the training, which is much less than a traditional university degree. I was saying at the beginning that lifelong learning is an opportunity, and I think that it's a huge opportunity, and be sure that universities will be able to take advantage of this situation. We are well prepared to provide an answer to this new challenge. Thank you very much.
Gracias por sus palabras. Efectivamente, esperemos.
Thank you for your kind. Next speaker in this opening session is Mr. Joaquín Perrey, Secretary of Employment and Social Economy. Mr. Perrey, doctor in law, extraordinary PhD thesis, professor of the University of Castilla-La Mancha. He also has a wide research and teaching curriculum, and I'm highly convinced that his words will throw some light on the importance of lifelong learning as a factor of change and relevant for the future. Mr. Perrey, thank you very much, Vice Rector, Minister, Rector, President of the CRUE. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to participate in this opening session, so important in these times. I'm the representative of employment in this table, how it is related to university. If someone were conscious enough to go back to their university notes, will realize that lifelong learning is indispensable because they would not find the keys to face the current world. Learning and lifelong learning, it's a demand of contemporary societies. Opposite challenge is related to employment, learning and training has so much importance. I think we have current debates nowadays that demand this lifelong learning notion. I was going to mention three of them, which are essential. We're going through a total transition ecological, digital, and transition. And in order for this transition to be fair, training to our fair victim transition. Ministry of Employment has highlighted the importance of labor reform and also the need to guarantee stability. Formalize every day at the employment. To renounce to this problem, which is the Spanish labor. Productivity, we are debating the reduction of working times, working hours. They need to reconcile in a healthier way profession and personal time. Productivity gains, less time dedicated to employment, more time to leisure and care. And this is also related to the need of training so we can increase our productivity by freeing this time for other tasks. How to put it into practice? Employment and labor relations perspective, this lifelong training, how to make it possible. I think we have to look at it under the perspective of law, and this is the way we're doing it. The right to training, the right to permanent learning, lifelong learning is an individual right of our workers, and this is the way it has to be conceived as something which is part of labor relations, the right to claim training and to adapt qualifications to the demands of our productive system. And this is the right of the system, such as our country's ecosystem, where we all are so important. This is the whole of different companies and those small and medium-sized companies. Because we have designed adequate which almost the monoculture of our country. And also, we have all the different administrations, labor, education, and university, and they have to join efforts, especially universities. The Minister Subirat says it often, and I underline his statement. The power of universities is intense enough so they do not remain outside training and learning in everything related to employment. So this is like doing without a capacity of training, which is absolutely huge, and also the most important part of training in our countries. Agreements between Public Service of Employment, Foundation for Employment, the Ministry of Work, and also the Ministry of Universities are key elements so universities can join, not like any other element. In fact, we're on this type of training with Public Services of Employment, state and autonomous, and they participate in an active way in the training of workers, of those who pretend to be workers, and they do it in a lifelong cycle. Participation of universities in this sense labor relations of high quality and stable. It's necessary to fight against all training is used in order to degrade employment conditions. We all work together with the Ministry of Universities in the statute of scholarship, which is going to be another element to guarantee that we have quality training without negative consequences on labor conditions. So thank you very much for giving me the floor in this opening conference. The Ministry of Employment, Social Economy and Deputy President will listen to the conclusions given by so many professionals who are going to speak at this table and have a fruitful conference and fruitful conclusions. Thank you. Thank you very much for providing such a wide perspective of those elements which are key for the debate. To close this opening session, I would like to give the floor to the Minister, Mr. Joan Subirats Humet, Minister of Universities. Mr. Subirats, you all know his political and academic trajectory. I would just like to highlight his relation with our university, Doctor of Economic Sciences by the University of Barcelona, and he was also previously trained and he received lifelong learning related to our university within his activity as chair of economic policies and emeritus chair of political sciences and the administration. He has been widely recognized from a national and international perspective. So without further ado, Mr. Subirats, you have the floor. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Rector of the University of Barcelona, my alma mater, as you have reminded, Rector Juan Romo, my friend Joaquin, Deborah, who is talking to us from the European Commission, rectors of the European universities, dear friends. Many things have been said, and this opening conference comes from the Ministry of Work, and we understand that it's of a relevant and significant importance at times of transition within universities. We're going through changing times, as we have said, and I think that in these changing times, which affect the future of universities, also the role played by lifelong learning, it's a central element. As Joaquin has said before, has mentioned before, the traditional sentence that one study one thing and that was useful for life is starting to change in a way that in order to work somewhere you have to follow a lifelong learning trajectory, which is a very important concept. We are far away from the statement that education is part of a vital moment and you shouldn't be trained anymore because this is something that you already learned when you had that opportunity. I think that we all agree that for many reasons this is not longer like that, and therefore the idea of thinking from a perspective of educational continuity is of a vital importance. Of course, Spain is not precisely in a good situation from the point of view of general training, learning of our citizenship. If we take a quick look at the numbers and we compare them with Europe, we would be at 40-20-40, when in Europe is 40-40-20. Higher education, secondary compulsory education, primary basic education. So we are equal to Europe in higher education, quite underneath related to secondary compulsory education, 20 compared to 40 in Europe. We are at 40 in primary compulsory education and the rest of Europe is at 20. But as we get older, so if we take a look at groups of age older than 30, 35, 40, this 40% grows up to more than 50. So there is a decalage, quite an important one in this sense. When the European Union at the Oporto Summit, May last year, placed as an objective that by 2030, 60% of the European population would be in a training process, and we are at 30%. So this is an indication that from the point of view of democratic quality maintenance, social inclusion, lack of training of the people who are members of this society. So learning is a key element. And we have to double it from a European perspective. And of course, the idea of lifelong learning, it's a democratizing factor. And I would like to stress that word. We need to work on this because the quality of our democracies is at stake. Spanish universities, lifelong learning occupies a peripheric position. We should be able to recognize this. Take a look at different ages. For example, the age group older than 30, we realized that of the total of students, postgraduate students and graduate students older than 30 in Spain are only 6%, which means that 94% is from 18 to 29. And this is an indication of a strong concentration in an age group. And everything points to the fact that this is a demographically group which is going to decrease. 20%, it's calculated during the next 20 years. So approximately 200,000 people of this age group will decrease in the next 20-25 years. So if we relate this to the installed capacity that we have, 50 public universities, 200 cities with the university center, 120,000 teachers, 60,000 packs. This will be more or less the installed capacity of our university system. So this is centered in an age group and is leaving apart important opportunities of lifelong learning. And this is an important claim that has to be made, and which is also present here today. The European Union is talking, as we have listened to, of micro-credentials. The director of the UB was telling me, we're already working on these micro-credentials. Yes, but we're doing it not so much in a strategic way, also with a vocation to complete our system. So not as complete as we wish. Many companies that have come to the ministry to speak about these subjects, also the Ministry of Work, say that universities, when they go to universities in general, they speak about postgraduates and PhD, but they don't speak about flexible courses, more adapted, so combination between social, business or university sphere are related in order to build together different flexible opportunities. I think this is important, also the idea to organize modular training courses, which also generate, and it is obvious that the vocational training is entering much stronger in levels 1 to 3, but let's remind ourselves that we have the capacity to work on professional vocation at levels 4 and 5. And this still has to be deployed. I think that we are all convinced of the fact that this is an important subject. Joaquin has mentioned this. We're talking with the Ministry of Employment, we have created the task force with CEPE in order to speak about all this and also to develop employment work and also different elements allowing us to combine these ideas and allowing universities to face these challenges. Of course, there are many questions we should approach, such as how to present the university offer with structures, incentives oriented somewhere else. Of course, within the radar of university students, this is something which is not present the way it should be, and this is quite important, how to stimulate the demand of people who are already working related to the possibilities offered by universities, how to, and forgive me for this expression, so our postgraduate students have an aftermarket service after coming to university, so they can have constant updating of their studies, and universities take care of them in their alumni network so they can access this training, how to take care of the quality of this training without too much bureaucracy, how to finance the system, which is an important element. Of course, all these elements are significant, and therefore we have to deploy and develop them. The European Union lawsuit, we are reinforcing different international aspects. The European space of higher education has made it very clear, and it's going to point in this line. And I think that we as university system and also as labor and employment policies have to be able to respond to the challenge that we have posed from a social perspective. So thank you very much.
Muy bien, muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all the panelists for such amazing presentations. Kindly step out of the podium, please, so we can start the following session. And the following panel discussion is entitled Universities as Long Life Learning Forums, a new border for higher education. I would like to ask Mr. Raúl Valdés Cotera from the UNESCO Institute to join the podium, please, to join the table to start with his presentation. Thank you very much.
No te perdono, la de la comisión.
No.
Muy bien.
No. Pregúntale a Jaume porque no la tengo.
Bueno, pues permítanme que les presente al ponente.
Let me introduce you to the following speaker. Mr. Raúl Valdés Cotera is from UNESCO, from the Long Life Learning Unit in UNESCO. He is the program coordinator in Hamburg, Germany, and he is the chair of the Global Network of UNESCO. For more than 15 years, he has been working in several public administrations in the field of public policy. So we would like to warmly thank him for having accepted our invitation to take part in today's session. And you have the floor as soon as you're ready, sir.
Muchas gracias. Perdón, tenemos aquí un asunto técnico, entonces no tarda más de 2 minutos.
We've got a little technological problem. We'll be back in a few seconds.
Bueno, podemos empezar.
Okay, I'm really sorry for the delay. Sometimes one cannot manage technical things, right? It is a pleasure for me to be here with you in this magnificent room, to be able to speak in Spanish, to be in Barcelona, and to have the opportunity to exchange a few words with the minister, with the secretary of state, and of course with the rector of this magnificent university, with the new president of the CRUE. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you to discuss about this very important topic. All the speakers have underlined the importance of lifelong learning. I believe we have an amazing opportunity ahead to rethink about lifelong learning and come up with a culture which is friendly towards lifelong learning in our societies. My presentation is based on the outcomes of a research project that was implemented in the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning in Hamburg, Germany. It's one of the 8 institutes of UNESCO, and the research was carried out in collaboration with Shanghai Open University and other partners. The research deals with a wide span of topics related to lifelong learning, and it includes case studies as well as a survey that was undertaken with 400 higher education institutions in the sample in 98 countries. So, the aim of my presentation today, well, first of all, let me tell you that I'll be as brief as possible. I would like to share some conclusions of the research from UNESCO's perspective, the relevance of lifelong learning for higher education institutions. I would like to refer also to some elements that will contribute to the transformation of higher education institutions into lifelong learning institutions, and I will of course share a few final remarks and conclusions. It is important to underline that at the end of the 60s and at the beginning of the 70s, lifelong learning was somehow anchored in a humanistic approach characterized by fundamental values such as human dignity, equality, social justice, and respect for cultural diversity, as well as a certain sense of shared responsibility and a commitment towards international solidarity. Today, these principles are more relevant than ever. Relevant for humanity, relevant for the current moment in history, and it's still relevant because it's all about understanding what can be achieved through learning, through education. It's also important to underline that we have come up with a more economic-based definition of the concept, with a strong focus on adaptation to the needs of the labor market, and with a strong focus of the concept economy of learning. This is reflected in all the documents produced by the European Union, by the OCDE, by the World Bank, and I believe it's an important element to take into account, considering that lifelong learning and the interpretation of the concept it has, let's say, impacts in terms of financing, in terms of social actors and individuals. So there are tensions, right? Because there's a risk to undermine the humanistic proposal from the 60s by Ivan Illich, in the 70s by Legrand, Faure, and at the same time I believe the tension is becoming more and more artificial, isn't it? Today, when we think about lifelong learning, we think about both the secular world, the labor market, the social and cultural fields that need to be also present. UNESCO promotes openness and considers that lifelong learning has to be based on integration, the integration of two very important concepts, learning on the one hand side and life. It's not about learning, it's not about education, sorry, it's about learning. There are some educational processes that do not translate necessarily into learning, and there are learnings that do not stem from an educational process. So we need to make a clear difference here. And then there is life, right? From birth to death, for all ages, in all contexts, and through a variety of models that respond to a wide scope of demands and needs related to learning. Let me give you more detailed examples of what I'm referring to. Let me see if this works. Please, could someone help me here? Because I want to move on with the presentation. Well, it doesn't really matter if it doesn't work. I'll proceed without the presentation. There are several important elements that need to be underlined. I oftentimes think about components, not so much definitions, right? Because concepts oftentimes go beyond definitions. A first element which needs to be bear in mind.
Le digo, perdón. El primero es una.
So, thank you. The first element that needs to be taken into account is the dynamic element of learning. Learning starts at an early stage in our life and expands throughout life from birth to death. And I believe that this is one of the most important concepts in order to define learning. Sometimes, well, I believe that we need to bear in mind other important elements. Let me dig into this second package of concepts that includes all levels of education and interrelates them. All levels of education are important. Technical education, adult learning. So it's all about understanding the articulation between different levels of education and how long life learning becomes present. Then there's a third element, which is inclusiveness. All learning modalities need to be accepted by lifelong learning schemes. It's important to understand also that we're speaking about formal, informal learnings, and it's very important to understand also that all these modalities are becoming less and less clear or well defined. More and more it is important to understand that in formal education environments we need to combine formal and informal teaching methodologies, because of course open dialogues, the internet, but at the same time we need to be there, we need to be clear about this reality. Then there's a fourth element which is related to all learning environments. Learning institutions are one of the key actors, of course, but there are community spaces, libraries, museums, and at home. You can learn from home, right? Thanks to online learning and thanks to community-based learning methodologies. As a result of that, it means that we need to build bridges between formal environments and informal learning environments, as well as ensuring that we promote flexibility in the pathways. We need a GPS, right, to move around the different educational environments. Where am I and how to move around? And then there's a wide variety of purposes, because lifelong learning places in the center the individual and human rights in order to ensure equality, inclusiveness in lifelong learning. And for that, we need to respond to the needs of very heterogeneous, let's say, audiences. We need to ensure a rich approach to lifelong learning because there are many pathways, there are as many pathways as human beings learning. Since 2015, with the adoption of the SDGs, and in particular objective number 4, learning is today not anymore an aspiration, but rather a commitment of the international community. SDG number 4 on education and lifelong learning as an important trigger to social development, or sustainable development rather, and lifelong learning is the conceptual framework and the key principle to organize learning institutions. We need to move from an institutional approach to a human-centered approach, and we need to place educational needs in the center of the process. At the beginning of this presentation today, it has been said that lifelong learning has regained a new meaning in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, with important changes in the offer side. There has been an incredible demand of informal learning, a much higher demand than in terms of formal learning, and of course this has had an impact in the accessibility of different educational environments. And now I would like to focus on how higher education institutions and lifelong learning are relevant. The average listener, well, it's difficult to say, but it's important to say it. We have oftentimes considered universities as conservative, elitistic, unflexible, especially the least or the less, well, those that have been left behind by university in the past. I believe that universities, and this is a living proof of what I'm going to say, I believe universities more and more are being capable of redefining themselves as lifelong learning institutions. They are adapting their offer to real needs of non-traditional learners. And little by little, universities have become key for lifelong learning. They have opened their doors to adults wishing to resume their educational pathways or acquire new skills and knowledge to satisfy their curiosity, which is very interesting, right? Curiosity is important.
Dicen los ingleses.
The joy of learning, as they say. This is very interesting, perhaps because I come from a context in which learning was not precisely a source of joy. Many institutions vaccinated me against education, actually. So lifelong learning offers me the possibility to say, we are all interested in learning. Yesterday I was wandering around Barcelona and I thought, wow, we learn so many things from different sources while walking around a city. And there is an infrastructure for learning. We're all looking forward to learn, but we learn in different ways. I believe that in this sense, higher education institutions are key. And they must be able to respond to demographic challenges, to rapidly changing realities, to adapt to new IT to new technologies and demographic change. What I believe is that universities have a unique position to tackle demographic trends and to promote lifelong learning thanks to their experience in knowledge production, innovation, and education.
Muy bien. Entonces voy a plantearles 3 áreas de...
So I'm going to be focusing on 3 action lines that have been documented, and I believe it's relevant to open a dialogue with you so that we can elaborate the debate. 1. We need to open political forums to support lifelong learning in higher education. 2. It is important to set up structures and institutional mechanisms that enhance lifelong learning. And 3. We need to widen access and participation among society at large. So, there are 3 levels: political, structures, financing, etc. And third, how to have access to, or how to allow social participation. In the following slides, I'll dig into each one of these points, and I will assess them on the basis of the outcomes from the survey I told you about at the beginning. Now, for the first action line, political action, I believe it is important to underline that political or friendly political environments are the basis for lifelong learning in higher education institutions. National policies and frameworks define lifelong learning as a key mission. Governments can push forward, boost lifelong learning in higher education institutions through sound policies, and institutional policies need to adhere to 3 missions of superior education, higher education, in all units, departments, faculties, etc. The outcomes of the survey to 396 institutions from all around the world conclude that 96% of higher education institutions define lifelong learning as a mission of higher education institutions, which somehow means that there's a friendly political environment in 96 of the countries, of the respondent countries. More specifically, the survey shows there is a correlation between the political environment, a friendly political environment, and the existence of institutional lifelong learning policies. So, it's important to underline the importance of friendly political environments in order to promote lifelong learning. In other words, when you have a national policy for lifelong learning, it is much more likely that institutional lifelong learning policies will see the light. And I think I'm having my technical problems again. Action number 2, or area number 2, structures to support lifelong learning. The integration of learning as a key responsibility in different units and departments requires of structures and mechanisms. I believe it is important to count on lifelong learning units, properly resourced, staffed. Financial support is very important to widen the span of products, lifelong learning products, and for that we'll have to go beyond the typical BA programs. We need to include alternative certification methods and pathways in order to ensure that lifelong learning makes sense, is relevant, and is well valued. We need to make sure that we ensure quality. These quality control procedures are key to ensure lifelong learning is trusted. The phenomena that is happening today in universities happens also at the labor market level, right? When you acknowledge previous skills and these skills are certified, the validity of such certificates is not the same. We need to align all these elements. Let's see the outcomes of the survey, and let's understand what are the financial, the sources of funding, rather, by institution. Lack of funding is a clear barrier for the expansion of lifelong learning schemes, and basic funding at the university level cannot always be invested in lifelong learning promotion, which are oftentimes a little bit more flexible, short-term, and count with different forms of certification. So it's normal that out of the 400 universities that responded to the survey, the enrollment fees are the main source of funding. So, institutions have different forms of funding for their lifelong learning activities, but the main source of funding, once again, is the engagement fees, or the enrollment fees, rather. Then there's a third area, which is very important in the framework of our research. More and more universities need to comply to a third mission, which is contributing to community development. And the third mission has to be defined as two of the traditional missions: learning, education, and research. And this engagement or commitment includes other elements such as widening the scope of services and resources provided by universities, and widening the number of non-traditional students. Non-traditional students are very heterogeneous, and they have very heterogeneous learning needs. In order to make sure that educational content is relevant, we need to adapt learning materials, including the curricula diversification. It is important also to include programs with and without certification. The minister already referred to this reality, as well as different teaching methods. Flexibility is important, including acknowledgement and certification of previous skills. All this is key in order to engage, bring, or attract heterogeneous pupils, and to comply with admission procedures. It's also very important, right, in order to try and avoid building barriers to the engagement of new students. Technology will allow us to engage more non-traditional students, because those who have family burdens will have a certain degree of flexibility in the way they learn. Last but not least, a key element to widen the scope has to do with committing with local communities and stakeholders in terms of articulating the dialogue between the university and the city, the university and the family. Tomorrow there will be, I believe, a conference on the topic, the debate between universities and the city.
Voy a ir muy rápido con esto.
I'm going to go very quickly with the different graphs, not to steal more of your time, but this one is addressed to the different groups through activities. And it's also very interesting to see that the groups to which those institutions of higher education are working with are workers, those who need the upskilling and reskilling, so to reinforce or widen their knowledge. Number two, to public and private organizations, and number three, women and personnel of the different institutions of higher education. In the case of those who use it less, we start by people who study in prison, immigrants, refugees, and those who drop out from school. And this is much more related to the labor market, and at the same time, it's a lesser commitment with the vulnerable groups of society. When we speak about policies for those who need flexible tools, we know it's a crucial element in order to allow for access, but in general, there is not a wide variation in the type of mechanisms they use. Numbers point to the fact that those flexible lifelong learning strategies could be widened, especially through the recognition, validation, and accreditation, and probably the ambition continues to be an obstacle in order to enter these higher institutions. When we speak about technology, and we know that technology is a fundamental tool from any place at any moment, which can be especially relevant for students with family responsibilities. But most of the institutions of higher institution do not offer any digital and non-digital alternative credentials beyond traditional degrees. Among the different lifelong learning innovation with the help of technology, the most selected one was conferences and online seminars. The most sophisticated ways of learning, as we were mentioning before, MOOCs, where technology can have an important role to play. Artificial intelligence, electronic portfolios in general are not used, and they leave a good margin of improvement. The following is how to relate institutions with the interested sectors and the community. One way of benefiting directly the communities is committed research with the community, which is relevant for local economies. Universities face themselves with a single position to help regional industries specialize with academic knowledge, or maybe provide ways in order to elaborate policies. 66% of universities tell us that their lifelong learning policies contribute to the ODS. And this is very well articulated, and 90% of universities are highly committed with the community. Their reports are established more frequently through the organization of conferences, public workshops, 80% collaboration with other universities and institutions of higher education, 77%, collaboration of NGOs and cultural institutions and communities from a research perspective, 64%, and above these aspects we have focalized our research. But now, due to my short time, I cannot approach it, but it's fundamental. I would like to talk about the specific commitment of the different institutions of higher education in the construction of learning in the community. And I'm thinking about the project made by universities for the construction of the World Wide Web network of learning cities of the UNESCO. I'm referring to this because it's the one I know. But of course, universities have made very important job in networks working with the city as educating cities, healthy cities, green cities, sustainable cities, and also kids-friendly cities. I think that universities have played a very important and a specific role. The World Network of Learning Cities searches to increase lifelong learning through local entities. And they do it through not only the will of the different governments, but also the different voices of society which can contribute to the organization and achievement of this objective. They have a single capacity for the production of exchange of knowledge and the capacity to unite different parties interested in the skills development. The advantage of cities, as you know, the bigger ones, compared to the approaches from a national perspective is that due to their closeness to governments, it is very easy to be able to define quicker policies and be quicker in the different implementation processes. Let me show you a case. I could easily show you the case of Barcelona, but let me show you the one of Swansea, which is a very important case. And this is a city in the province of Wales in the United Kingdom. And it's very interesting because they started their procedure of cities, of learning cities, as an alternative to the unemployment problem. They had, well, in questions related to labor ratio, they're very much underneath the indicators of the United Kingdom. So what they tried to do was to establish entrepreneurship courses, not only at universities, but also education institutions in general. Governments of the city decided to articulate themselves with the university and to promote this business initiative, and private initiative was also placed in this. And they had 3 different parts working in order to articulate this business initiative. I'm not going to dwell on this idea. Many things have improved, not only from a labor perspective, but also from the possibility of articulating the collaboration among different entities for different types of inclusion policies. And what is clear is that universities, from an innovation perspective, they have been of a great help to the city. There are many examples such as this one, which allow us to take a look at the wealth of the universities in order to collaborate with the cities. That's all I wanted to say. And these are my main conclusions, which is the importance of the political environment in order to be able to generate lifelong learning. Number 2, the importance of finance in activities. I think this is a key element that has to be discussed for lifelong learning opportunities through life. Importance number 3 of reaching non-traditional students and cover their learning needs. Number 4, to think together about the different admission procedures so they do not become an obstacle in order to widen the access. And if they require changes, to be able to implement them. Number 5, I think that technology is opening a huge door. We have to think about it and acting in consequence. And last point is participation of the community, which is an important way of fulfilling our 3rd mission and to become a local agent for change. I think that higher education institutions are fundamental to adopt a lifelong learning culture, but its potential is still to be deployed. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias por esta brillante.
Thank you very much for this brilliant presentation, and thank you very much for throwing light inside on formal learning and the ways learning takes place. Thank you, Jaume. And now, although we're running very, very late, we are going to open a brief Q&A. So if somebody would like to ask a question, you can ask in English and we will translate the question. Thank you.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias. Supongo que más adelante tendremos la.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure that later on we'll have the opportunity to debate and to share these opinions. Thank you.
Muy bien, pues pasamos a continuación a la siguiente mesa dentro de esta jornada que ya.
So we continue to this session, which is called Universities as Lifelong centers, policies, and inspiring practices. So I'd like to ask Ms. Antsiako Malinka, Director of Training and Quality of Online Learning Unit, to join us at the table. Mrs. Konvalika is going to be the moderator of the roundtable, and therefore she's the one who's going to introduce the different speakers. I invite them to come up to the rostrum. I would like to introduce Mr. Simon Roy from the team of higher education policies of the OECD, Organization for the Cooperation and Economic Development. And we are also going to listen to Mr. Michael Gaider, Director of the University, Higher Education of the Development University Association. And finally, we are going to listen to Mr. Michael Pum, Director of the Institute for the Future of Education of the Technologic of Monterrey. And also online, Ms. Vanessa Debier, we kindly ask you to use a microphone because there is a huge echo in the room when you speak, and it's also very difficult for the interpreters. So we hope you will be able to use a microphone online. Thank you.
And thank you to all our speakers today who are accompanying us. A few ground rules here. The questions will be directed one to each of the speakers. We have a set of questions. We might not get to them all. I would ask you to keep your responses brief because we do have a limited time.
Ya les pueden ayudar. Desde una perspectiva individual. Pueden también complementar y potenciar los programas educativos y ser proporcionadas por una serie de proveedores en distintos entornos de aprendizaje. Y vemos una necesidad cada vez mayor y vemos también muchos proveedores distintos. Al mismo tiempo, vemos una brecha importante, brechas importantes porque no hay diferencia en Europa o definición de lo que es un microcredencial, ni tampoco hay nada que permita garantizar que la calidad o el reconocimiento y la posibilidad de los mismos. Y este es el motivo por el que la Comisión ha estado trabajando con una amplia gama de participantes en los últimos 2 años y acabamos de presentar el pasado mes de diciembre una propuesta para las distintas condiciones sobre las microcredenciales que están siendo debatidas por el Consejo de Europa. Y nosotros esperamos que esta resolución sea adoptada a mediados de junio de este año. ¿Qué es lo que nosotros proponemos? Nosotros estamos proponiendo una distintos sectores, no solamente para la educación superior, sino también para la formación profesional. Por ejemplo, además de estas funciones, nosotros estamos proponiendo estándares europeos, es decir, estamos hablando de criterios comunes europeos para poder definir y para poder describir las microcredenciales Por ejemplo, cuando se trata de resultados de aprendizaje que pueden subrayarse en los créditos cuando sea aplicable o cuando se trata de otro tipo de participación, y también cuando se trata de información importante que se tiene que responder de manera transparente para la validación o como indicación de las organizaciones. Por lo tanto, esta transparencia es esencial para la confianza, y esta es la confianza que desencadena el reconocimiento entre los distintos sectores. Bien, esta condición y este enfoque europeo también proporciona una serie de pautas y principios para cualquier proveedor, incluyendo las instituciones de educación superior, cuando se diseñan los microcredenciales. O sea que estamos muy contentos de que la mayoría de las universidades europeas, instituciones europeas, estén dando estos pasos, y seguramente es aprendizaje de por vida y las distintas que nos permiten tener en cuenta cursos más breves, llevando a microcredenciales, y pueden ser el camino para muchos otros. Y el programa Erasmus Plus nos ofrece también apoyo financiero a todas las instituciones de educación superior que quieren desarrollarse y dar apoyo a las microcredenciales. Pues muchas gracias. Es una buena perspectiva. Pues, y gracias por el trabajo que han estado ustedes haciendo en este sentido. Tenemos una pregunta de Mijail. Si nosotros pensamos en las universidades, en cuanto a proveedores, el enseñar las actividades de por vida se puede ver como una responsabilidad o un peso por los estudiantes que se encuentran con pocos recursos y cuyas carreras, cultura, incentivos, pues a veces están desorientados. ¿Qué estrategias ha visto ustedes para garantizar la cultura de por vida en instituciones de educación superior? Pues probablemente, para empezar, buenos días a todos, pues probablemente para empezar una perspectiva un poquito más amplia acerca del aprendizaje de por vida. Creo que es importante ver que cada universidad lo haga a distintos pasos y probablemente de distintas maneras, y depende también del tipo de misión que tienes. Si vienes de una universidad abierta, por lo tanto es básicamente, pero no quiero decir que cada universidad que veas dependerá del tipo de institución, y sobre todo también cuando estás en la virginidad de una universidad, el papel evidentemente seguramente nos da unas competencias mejor aplicadas. Lo que vemos en muchos es que a veces están dirigidas por objetivos individuales. En algunos departamentos podemos ver diferencias entre países, seguramente debido a la cultura tradicional, pero también el reconocimiento de algunos de los sistemas que nos dan aprendizaje de por vida, que a veces es más complicado que en otros. Y me parece que es un punto decisivo. Y si miramos también lo que hace la universidad, a menudo se organiza de un modo un poquito distinto, separado de la oferta regular. Y esto en parte se debe al objetivo que tiene, y tiene que ver también con aspectos legales. Es decir, que nos encontramos también con la financiación que es distinta y otro mecanismo de QA, y también enseñado por otros profesores. Y sobre todo es en respuesta también a las necesidades locales que se han de evaluar. Cuando vemos lo que se proporciona, vemos que no es solamente cuáles son las competencias que necesita el mercado, eso también es un problema, es decir, actualizar, reorientar a todas estas personas que ya tienen un grado profesional, que continúen con la formación profesional, incluyendo habilidades de investigación, pero eso incluye también universidades, programas de por vida. Por lo tanto, me parece que eso también es muy importante.
learners, also for the regular students. I think one point is when you ask how to showcase this lifelong learning, you can go to individual universities, but it's not easy to get an overview on that. It's done very differently, and you have actually to go on your websites and see what they offer. And that might be very different from one institution to the next. And I think one reason for this is, of course, because they respond to local demand in their environment, and also because it's often driven by individuals. But I think an important point is also that this is not seen really as a core mission of the university. I mean, the minister said it this morning, you know, it should be, and UNESCO also said it, and I completely agree on that, and we have been pushing for that, turning this into a core mission of the university. But if you look at what universities are assessed, it's not their achievement in lifelong learning. You know what it is. It's about research mainly, isn't it? And it's changing a bit. We are coming more to looking also what universities do on education. But I think so this is an important point. And when you then come to the question, why do individual staffs, or is it challenging to get individuals teaching lifelong learning classes? I guess it might, because you have to teach them to different type of learner. You may have to teach it at different times, including evenings and weekends. But I think the main point is here is you might not get any recognition for that as a staff member. Your career is still defined by research. And if you want an answer and a strategy on how to change that, change academic assessment, change academic career. Easy, isn't it?
I wish it were that easy, yes. One of the things that you mentioned about the variety of lifelong learners and lifelong learning leads us to our next question for Michael Fang. Lifelong learning is a broad concept, as we've seen. Universities could focus on highly specialized upskilling and reskilling, or on the other end, on providing higher education opportunities to adult non-graduates. What do you believe is the niche for universities?
Thank you for the question. I would make my remarks from two different perspectives. First, from a policy-making perspective, I've led the skills future movement in Singapore. I've been involved in economic development, in labor market development, and education development in Singapore. But also the second perspective from an institutional perspective. So having worked in universities in Singapore and Hong Kong, now in Mexico, so I would look at it from both of those perspectives. I think if we look at universities, the traditional model has been very much focused on degree-seeking students, and we all know that. But there's also a spattering of executive education and professional education offered by different universities. And some have actually gone quite far into continuing education through extensions, through catering to a much wider set of competencies. But I think beyond that, we really have to think about lifelong learning as much broader than that range of offering. Because here the opportunity that we're looking at is how do we provide education and learning opportunities throughout life so that individuals remain employable. So just degree programs, executive education, professional education is not enough. It's not wide enough in terms of access, it's not long enough in terms of career and lifespans. But beyond that, I think we also have to look at lifelong learning through a self-actualization and human flourishing perspective. And I think Raul had touched on that a little bit during his presentation. The ability for an individual to continue learning for life is going to help the goal of human flourishing. And so I think when we look at both of those perspectives, I do think we need to look at lifelong learning from a universal access perspective. I think few countries will argue against providing universal access for formal education. Many countries invest heavily in formal education. But now we need to look at lifelong learning as a public good. How do we provide universal access to lifelong learning so that our labor market stays relevant and individuals stay employable and our population can continue to actualize themselves? So I think universities have an advantage in this space. Universities are trusted, they have the brand, they have established quality mechanisms, they have a culture of teaching and learning. But just as Michael has mentioned, they are not well suited to cater to a much more diverse range of learners. So universities have to develop new governance capabilities. Faculty has to develop new capabilities to reach out to different types of learners. And I think there are three opportunities, and potentially you can look at it as policy imperatives. First is to have universities expand to serve a wider segment of learners, not just traditional students, but students beyond that. But beyond just giving different learning opportunities is how do you create pathways, feasible pathways, so that people who are seeking job mobility, career advancement, can actually take a range of different pathways regardless of their starting points. And thirdly is to increase linkages to industry needs, not just technical skills, but also the soft skills and competencies. I'll just end with sort of two examples of what we've done in Singapore, but also at Tec de Monterrey that I'm working at. In Singapore, we had taken advantage of the decline in birth rates and the reduction in university enrollments. We've taken advantage of that to encourage, should I use the word, encourage universities to take on more non-traditional learners. So we use funding levers, policy levers, and in order to maintain the level of funding, they had to move much more aggressively into that space. And today in Singapore, the higher education institutions have about a third market share of the adult workforce education space, which I think is quite significant given the traditional DNA of universities. And there are a range of offerings from digital marketing, design thinking, leading change, cybersecurity, and so on that they offer to the wider segment of population. In the example from Tec de Monterrey that I'm at, we have a subsidiary, Tec Millennial, that offers alternative pathways to adult learners. That includes degree programs, certificate programs, a range of offerings, but I think we can do more in terms of catering to a wider range of learners. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take away from that the idea of alternate and feasible pathways. That's a very important aspect. Everyone seems to agree on the idea of the need for lifelong learning as part of the discourse of why we want to do lifelong learning, a need to learn, to improve, and to update our skills. But to make the scheme work, this need must translate into demand and uptake. This is a question for Simon Roy. Will the demand arise just by supplying higher quality, relevant, and convenient micro-credentials? Or are working adults under so many constraints that outreach, motivation, and incentives to learn are required? And do you have any examples of inspiring policies in this regard?
Thanks for the question, and good morning, everyone. Essentially, the question of demand, of course, is key, and if we take a step back, in lifelong learning policy and in adult learning policy in general, that has been the big problem facing governments and facing education suppliers, is motivating people and getting people to take up adult learning opportunities. The OECD did a relatively large project, and it's an ongoing project on surveying adult skills. It's PIAC, the survey. There'll be a new edition coming relatively soon. But the evidence from that highlights that around half of the adults surveyed at all levels of education, but in OECD countries, half of them said, to the question, have you engaged in any learning in the last 12 months? They said no, and also said, do you want to engage in some learning? Also said no. That's half of the population. There were other parts of those populations where who were surveyed who are saying that they do want to do more. Either they engaged, or they want to engage more, or they're already doing some learning and they don't want to do any more. So there's various patterns there, and it's important to think about those publics and those populations when we're talking about lifelong learning and how you engage to try and stimulate the demand side and the take-up if we're to achieve the goals, which indeed there is the human fulfillment goal, but there's also this upskilling and reskilling goal that's talked about a lot. And if you want to reach the people who need the additional skills, that's very important. If we then, higher education within that picture has advantages because you're serving, in many cases, you're providing education at a relatively advanced level. All of the evidence shows those who already have a degree of advanced level, so either already have higher education or have high school at the least, or post-secondary of some kind, those are the most motivated and engaged people in the population. So you already have an advantage as higher education in comparison to those serving the lower skills. But the people who are seeking, or when you're seeking to engage higher education, people in higher education, you're facing essentially also the same factors as other areas. There's the question of the relevance and attractiveness of the offer. Is it something for me? Is it something I want to engage in? There's something about having information to that. Am I aware of that? And there's then the commonly discussed questions of time, so the flexibility, how much, how long, and money, how much does it cost? And if we look at that, you see many countries are seeking to address different parts of that. They're seeking to promote relevant offer, or in universities as well, of course. I mean, higher education institutions provide that relevance, something that's attractive and you can see why you need it. You also see the flexible provision increasingly common, but with all of the difficulties that Michael and the Michaels have highlighted. And the financing, you do see some systems in OECD countries where they are starting to put public money in there. But fundamentally, very few countries have got this right, and that's the sort of constatation, the starting point that we have at the OECD at the moment for some more work that we need to do this, that there's so many things going on, but few have the answers. And I think you do have your question was like, where are the inspiring examples? And I think you have elements of inspiring. You have, for example, Nordic countries with very long tradition of very flexible learning, very open learning. But for example, in Nordic countries, which by the way provide free higher education to undergraduate students, you have to pay to do, as an adult, to do part-time education, for example, in a country like Denmark or Finland. So there's actually, the financing side is actually more restrictive than for undergraduate students. You have other issues as well in terms of sort of the relevance and of provision. I think Ireland is at the moment one of the countries where we see some very interesting things going on that we would like in terms of specifically the upskilling and reskilling rather than the broader lifelong learning debate, where they're trying to provide targeted courses which are free, which in a country where things are not free, for people to reskill in areas of national demand, so ICT and so on. So I think there are examples out there, but no one has the answers in this.
But I think you've given us some good possibilities that we can think about there. Now, I have one more question for each person, but they're going to have to be very short answers because we can't go too much over time. So my first question would be going back to Vanessa Debier. You spoke to us about the crucial feature of lifelong learning being quality, for both learners and employers to recognize the value of these micro-credentials. What assurance mechanism or accreditation policy would guarantee a quality experience that meets learner needs without weakening the creativity, flexibility, and diversity of this supply?
Yes, thanks a lot. I would like to build on what Michael Gable just said before, that micro-credentials can be used for a wide diversity of purposes, and I will give some examples. For example, they can be used to improve access to education and training for all learners, including those from disadvantaged and vulnerable groups, by allowing those that usually can't engage in traditional education and training because of their personal or professional situation. And this gives them the ability to learn in a more flexible way and build their own flexible pathways. It can also be used to support the transition from secondary to tertiary education and or vocational education, training education. This can be done, for example, by using micro-credential as a way for pupils to test a field or discipline before joining university as a better way to orient themselves. And we see already examples happening in a number of higher education institutions across Europe. Some others are using micro-credentials to support the development of digital skills for all learners of all ages, from the most advanced ones like coding to the most basic ones. Another example, very important, is to train teachers, academics, and other professionals through their professional lives to develop new skills and keep up with the latest technological developments and new ways of teaching. Another one, very important as well, is to develop knowledge, skills, and competencies for environmental sustainability, as it is done, for example, with the ones developed by Europa Alliance, but also many others, that allow students to gain in-depth knowledge on global sustainability challenges and the sustainable development goals. So in all those cases, quality is absolutely key. Universities already have quality assurance mechanisms in place for full degrees that can also be applied to micro-credentials. And that is why higher education institutions have such a key role in lifelong learning to ensure quality. But also a very strong cooperation with the labour market is also absolutely key, with all kinds of different providers of micro-credentials, so that universities can help them as well to ensure quality based on their quality assurance mechanism, but also labour market or companies can help universities as well to make sure the courses delivered more relevant to the needs of the labour market. So it's really, we see there potential for win-win cooperation between universities and the social economic actors.
Thank you very much. We've been speaking about flexibility and convenience, just-in-time learning. Online learning seems to be a way to get this done, but universities have often, for a long time, depended on the idea of uniqueness, competitive advantage with personalized learning, in-person learning, and interactions between faculty and peers. Which do you think is the right strategy? Michael Gebel.
I think you can do both, probably, and we have examples for institutions which do both. So they cater to recent school graduates, but also provide very flexible, continued professional education tailored to industry needs. There are benefits from doing this. You learn from the lifelong learning provision for your regular learning and teaching. We have seen over the years a growing push for more flexible learning, also for regular learning and teaching provision for recent school graduates. But I think one thing that we have to keep in mind is that the vast majority of the school graduates who come to higher education, they want a different experience. They don't go there to pick up a few skills through micro-credentials and stake them then into a degree. That may happen, that could be a case, but I think it's not the vast majority. So what I would foresee is that the bachelor degree, as it stands with the changes, transformations that it might take, that might continue because students want to be on campus. They want to meet. It's a social experience. The peers are important. The whole idea of the university, the surrounding. I would be less sure about the masters. It will all depend also a bit on the frameworks that we set here. Michael just gave the example of Singapore and how you can stimulate and encourage lifelong learning. Simon has also said that for the Nordic countries, and also that nobody at the moment has a model. So I think the question is how you build on the one hand side national and probably also European models. That's something that we can explore together. The question is for every university also, as Vanessa also talked about quality, what can I do actually good and what is an appropriate provision there? And then, we should also not forget, it's in a way, it's still also an area where you have for profits providing learning. And sometimes they can do that probably faster than we can, and also for purposes in which the university might not want to buy in. So I think that's how I see it at the moment. One example probably about what I mean when I said setting the frameworks. I mean, we have seen how the MOOCs came up, and that's something that exists now. We don't talk that much about it anymore, but it probably contributes in one way or the other to what Michael said about universal access, yeah? Only that this is produced by universities with public taxpayers' money, at least in Europe, it's mainly paid by the public purse, and it's on international platforms, mainly US-based. So I think that's just as a reminder, and probably also think about what we do, think about research publications and the situation that we have there, and then think about what are the frameworks that we need for lifelong learning in the future, and who should own them.
Thank you very much. A quick question for Simon Roy. You've spoken to us about accessibility, about public funding guaranteeing equal education opportunities. How do you think public funding should work? What role should it have for this objective?
Right, very briefly on obviously quite a challenging area, but yeah, I think the key point is the role of higher education institutions in lifelong learning is recognized. It's often in their legal missions. The question then is it recognized in the core public funding that is provided from the state to higher education institutions, which in Europe and in most Euro states is a key element of their funding. That's often not the case. There are a few examples, places like Finland, where they have a specific element in their formula that funds lifelong learning. You also have then the issue of how you support on the student side, of course. So and that's the other method that's used, and is something that can be interesting, is providing funds or free tuition essentially to students to allow them to access lifelong learning courses. And that's the approach of the individual learning accounts to some extent, that you would be able to have a personalized sort of voucher that allows you to pay for the access. So those are the two main models, and what's the right balance? I think overall our view on the institutional funding is that the diversity of missions of higher education institutions should be recognized in when government hands over money, but you shouldn't necessarily overcomplicate the allocation mechanism with multiple indicators and multiple set little pots of money, because that complicates the job of higher education institutions. So it's something about like pouring some money into the pot to give to higher education institutions, saying that's part of your job, but not overcomplicating things.
Thank you very much. And we've got one last question for Michael Fung. We've spoken about micro-credentials and all of the ways that lifelong learning can be provided through master's degrees at a university, or someone signing up here in Barcelona, someone signing up in London for an online degree, or boot camps, MOOCs, companies providing education opportunities. How should the public universities play this game in order to stay completely relevant?
First, I think we need to recognize that universities are not monopolies of learning. And many times in our attention and policy making, we only think about that space. But if you think about lifelong learning, we really should be thinking about the various actors in that space, including private training providers. They have proven to be very effective at bridging particular market gaps at speed. But of course, they are profit-driven. So we have to look at what is the space that they play well in, and what's the space that universities play well in. And there are many other forms of learning, right? Workplace learning, apprenticeships is a form of learning, but there are also forms of learning that are informal in nature. How do we think about learning as an entire system? That I think it's going to be important. For universities specifically, I think universities should look at development of MOOCs, alternative pathways, alternative credentials, not to look at that as competition, but to look at a complement to what the universities are offering. Because I think what we've seen in the development of MOOCs is that, universities have not disappeared. When MOOCs first came about, we were predicting the demise of universities. But universities have particular strengths that cannot be easily duplicated or replicated. And part of that is the social learning when people come to campus, the wider learning of different perspectives, multicultural skills, and so on. So I think universities would do well to incorporate these other forms of learning within the curriculum design. Some universities have started doing that. I give a couple of examples from Singapore. The Nanyang Technological University has specifically stated that students can gain credits from attending particular courses on Coursera or on edX, and they recognize that. The National University of Singapore has moved to a model where they think about a curriculum, undergraduate curriculum, not just as a 4-year degree, but a 4+20, right? So they have to move their structures into recognizing these. And at Tech de Monterrey, we have also made changes in our academic policy to now allow for recognizing of micro-credentials as part of curriculum. But I want to bring about 2 important points that underlie the success of micro-credentials. One is having the right standards and frameworks in place. One of the problems for universities is to go figure out all these different possibilities and what are the standards, how do they interoperate with the language, the competency language that we're looking at. So some form of a skills taxonomy, some kind of framework around that is helpful. And to have those recognized by employers as well, that's the other critical factor. Because the path towards employability, towards employment outcomes is critical for micro-credentials to be successful at scale. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I know we all have many, many more questions. We'd love to continue talking for another hour or so. It's not possible at this point. I think you've given us many things to talk about and to think about for our universities. So thank you very much for all of your information, your inspirations, and your ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot of questions from the audience, so if you can stay here for a while.
Absolutely. I know there's a microphone out there somewhere, and if anyone has a question they would like to put. I don't know. There is a question back there, I believe. Yes.
Hello, everybody. I'm Stefano Pedarra from Erasmus Student Network Spain. So our organization, as you may know, advocates for internationalization of education and international mobility. And what I wanted to ask you if you think there is room for international mobility in the lifelong learning context, and how this can be internationalized. Thank you very much.
Who would like to address that question? Michael.
Yes, absolutely. I think when you think about the future of work, it's going to be a lot more globalized. Multicultural skills, international skills is very important. So one of the things, again, I go back to the example in Singapore, one of the things that we recognized was that for the Singapore workforce to be successful working in regional countries in the Southeast Asian region, language skills was important, the international experience is important, and so we designed specific programs that provided exposure to countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and so on. So after going through that lifelong learning program, they would have some degree of competencies and the confidence to take on those job opportunities around the region.
Thank you very much. I don't know if there's anything else. Yes, would you like to add something, Mikhail?
I think it could be a clear purpose of the program, as Michael just described it, in particular for learners who have not had international experience so far. But I also would think that it might require different types and formats of mobility, given also that you probably have learners who are in the workforce who have caring duties and might not be flexible enough to go a half a year abroad. So
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you again to all the speakers. Empezamos ahora ya la última mesa dentro de esta jornada.
The last panel discussion, participation of universities in long life learning in Spain. The panel will be facilitated by Mr. Andrés Afolafero, Director of the Higher Education Unit of the Spanish Service for the Internationalization of Education. Amongst us, Ángel Pazos Carro, President of CRUE and Rector of Cantabria University, Mr. Ardoy, Director General of the Public Service, Madam Marion Aleson, Director of the Permanent University of Alicante University, and Don Andreu Mascullell, Emeritus Professor of Pompeu Fabra University and former Regional Minister of the Economy of the Catalan University, of the Catalan government rather. And, well, you've got the floor.
Buenos días, comenzamos entonces esta segunda mesa.
Okay, we're going to start with the second panel discussion entitled The Participation of Universities, Lifelong Learning in Spain. We are going to be speaking about elements which are the result of the debate and previous presentations. We're going to ask you please to be as brief as possible and as specific as possible, considering that we are running short of time. In the first panel there has been a call to action that we need to bear in mind, considering where we want to get and considering our departing point and the main obstacles and barriers that we tackle or face. We have 4 speakers with a great knowledge of the Spanish university system, as well as the labor market and lifelong learning. We're going to be discussing about the strategies and specific policies that can be implemented in order to enhance universities' participation in the revolution, in the educational revolution that we are immersed in. If you all agree, we're going to start by asking a general question, such as what are the main challenges, right? The first question is for Mr. Ángel Pazos. Mr. Pazos, in university lifelong learning, we don't start from scratch, right? According to the figures that the minister gave us, we have, the minister said that less than 6% of the training or the curricula in university is, let's say, participated by adults of more than 30 years. Angel, where do we stand today and what are the main barriers that we face when it comes to attracting to university older students? Good morning. Yes, we do not start from scratch. Actually, we have a very uneven situation. I believe that on the one hand side, we have a relatively important segment of lifelong learning studies devoted to seniors. And there, many universities have done a tremendous effort with the launchment of very serious programs. Then there is another segment that has increased recently, quite significantly, but there is no specific, let's say, idea about what is it that we want to do. And here we are speaking about lifelong learning, targeting individuals who have recently finished their university studies. Here I'm thinking about our own certificates with a high degree of specialization, masters, etc. And here we have a very important offer. Yeah, a very important offer, which would be difficult to divide in categories. But of course, from CRUE and thanks to the new Royal Decree on university universities is being well structured. And of course, where we have a minority position is in the permanent long life learning related to employability. I believe we are a minority actor, even if some universities are doing an excellent job. How can this be improved? Well, let me start by saying something which is obvious. If you want institutions to, we need to legislate and we need to incentivize. It's very weird or very rare that an institution or an individual moves around and changes, let's say, directions, unless you set targets and a structure to do so, right? So we'll need to give incentives to universities. We'll need to give incentives to teachers, professors, lecturers, and clerks in universities if we want to go down this line. Secondly, we will have to do an effort in terms of management. Our universities have not been designed nor for management complex processes, nor for admission processes. Then we'll discuss about employability. Universities have not been designed to easily adapt to CP programs, so we'll need to do an effort. I will conclude by saying that we'll have to do an extra effort to redefine where we are headed towards. And I will speak about many specific elements. We need to define properly what we want to do with micro-credentials.
Let's take a look at how can we define our micro-credentials within the European framework, how to define it from infrastructure point of view, quality. We're going to introduce them in the evaluation agencies, digitalization, how can we carry out all this process of portability and certification. So I would say, to answer this question, that if we want universities to move forward, training and lifelong training to become an important element, as the ministry was saying, it's a secondary element now. We'll have to incentivize the personnel, we'll have to incentivize the institution, and also a clear definition of objectives by the universities. We have something to do, which is our responsibility. The administrations, they have another one, and also companies. We have to be able to empower this dialogue, because one part of lifelong training has to do directly with what the employers need. Well, thank you very much. And you have already highlighted the many challenges that we are facing. There are also some successes, or many successes, and I would like to ask Ms. Marian Alesson, Director of the Permanent University of Alicante, what are the different experiences which can tell us about what can work in a more systematic way in other types of learning, such as the ones we're approaching here today. Yes, good morning, and thank you very much for giving me the floor. I would like to continue with and expand a little bit the ideas proposed by Mr. Pothos, because the university, we're always moving forward towards innovation, developing projects in order to be prepared for reality. In this case, we have many banks of experiences which are retrofitted by this research, the one that we carry out. Research projects, research and development, research in Horizon Europe, research, Erasmus+, which allow us to test new learning methodologies, to test new systems, to compare them, to evaluate them under this international framework, which provides a wider perspective. Let me speak to you about my subject, which is seniors education, people older than 50, universities and university programs for older people are these test banks where we have been able to implement this lifelong learning which can have a nuance of vocational training, because we can try to invest in people developing new skills or acquiring them anew, or maybe to improve those capacities, but also this lifelong education, because we're going to live for many years, much longer, and we cannot stay, as we have said previously, at this starting point, which are 22 years old when we finish our career and we have a set of knowledge. We will have many turning points around our life, and we should be able to adapt. And this is the challenge that we face as universities. Let me tell you how we've done it with the older group of population, opening this opportunity, bringing universities closer to people and satisfying their needs. We had to adapt different programs, curriculums. We had to adapt the management, because university management is not adapted to these new challenges and changes. We had to adapt methodologies, because we are talking about different students. An older student with experience is someone who reaches the university with some background. He doesn't need the same thing as new students. He just needs to develop different skills. Learning should be adaptable, flexible, and we have to make it cost efficient. How do we do it? By making learning and teaching hours most cost effective. They have to be designed for those specific needs. The university has to be close to employment, has to be close today, and we need how to adapt these universities. Presentiality, we have spoken about MOOCs, online, but we should not discard the presential aspects of all this. Something which is more flexible, drinking from these new technologies. Maybe it's not necessary to show everything. University should open the doors to the outside world, and maybe this knowledge that we are creating through research has to reach the world and people needing it. Why? In order to live better, to be able to adapt to changes. And those changes in professional life and also lifelong, when we stop working, we are 60, 67. How many years ahead? The world is going to change. So this is another moment, another process. Like at the age of 18, what do I want to do with my life? We need new skills. We need new ideas and competences. And of course, this leads us out of our comfort zone. We're going through a moment of transformation and change, where universities are trying to make a step forward, take a step forward to provide an answer to what society is asking us. And obviously, if I go back to what my previous speaker was saying, we need an umbrella, normative umbrella, providing us this flexibility, financing, because we are saying that teaching should be financed, teachers should make an effort to change, students also. We are facing many challenges, but we also have experiences of good practices, as we are saying, thanks to these universities for the elderly, when they are not entertained, but just helping them to adapt, change, and learn new things. Thank you very much for this concise definition, and also for showing us some practices that have been developed. Let's now go to things which are related to structure, and this is a question for Andreu Mascolei. One of the key elements is related to modularity, being able to create modules which make sense independently, but which can be accumulated until we obtain a higher education. These studies are relevant in lifelong studies, and also with different training modalities. We have spoken about micro-credentials, micro-degrees, or other short-term programs. Mr. Masculei, in this sense, would it be important parallels between official titles? Should they be able to capitalize different micro-credentials in official master? And the opposite, maybe a degree that you have not finished, maybe should give way to some micro-credential or intermediate recognition. Well, thank you very much. There are some training segments which make sense in themselves, which can be of any length from a credit point of view, except counting credits. I wouldn't pose any restriction there. And of course, I would make an effort to recognize everything which is recognizable. meaning everything which makes sense from an educational perspective. Therefore, I will try to provide an intermediate recognition to the university degrees, favor the teaching organization, and above all, mobility among centers, but also among centers and work. Intermediate recognition could be, for example, our own studies. In this sense, I have to say that, of course, I will move in the direction of not sacralizing the distinction between mine and our ones, which will count in the context of lifelong learning, is an accreditation of an agency of prestige, public or private, and the role of these agencies and accreditation and quality control will be fundamental, and the prestige will come from the practice and competences of those who have these titles. So this is what's happening today with the postgraduate course, Business 1, X accreditations that we have to recognize, which are testing grounds, very well established, and that we have to use in order to learn from them. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Masculay, for your comments and proposals. Let me go to the role of public employment. And this is a question for Mr. Gerardo Gutierrez. In our country, the employment services are the ones with the longest trajectory in training courses related to active policies of employment with different modalities such as profiles, sectors, and training format. From your perspective and experience, what can universities contribute with that other actors of the systems are not providing, covering the needs of the working population and productive sectors? Good morning. First of all, thank you very much for inviting us to this interesting conference. Very briefly, because we ran out of time, I would like to mention 4 points. What the university can directly incorporate, and this is an opportunity because 2022, with the normative changes that we have implemented in employment and training, we're about to introduce all the changes that have to be introduced in order for the university to become a benchmark in vocational training. First of all, this continuity in the university structures, physical, virtual, no doubt the fantastic human capital for knowledge transmission. Secondly, a very important contribution in a place where everything is at stake, which is the detection of training needs. The network of observatories of the university and the network of the orientation centers of the universities, and this is something we are working on. Director of Information and Statistics, Federico Muñiz, is here with us, working with many universities. We need the report of whatever is happening in the labor market real time. So what happens is, like García Márquez in the introduction of Cien Años de Soledad, things were so recent that you had to point to them with your finger in order to name them. So we don't even know how to define them. And the university has to be able to bet in favor of this and incorporate them to these protocols of detection of training needs. Another important thing is the exchange of vocational training of the network of companies with which many companies collaborate. And that's also very important, this network of companies establishing trust relations with the universities. This is a third element to take into account. And finally, something which is very important because it's going to become the first experience that many students will have of going to university. And this is very important in the world we are living. Many young people, and not so young, thought that you can receive training in the university network, and it's very important to provide them a possibility to generalize and democratize, bringing the equality principle to the extreme that anybody can access the university and be trained in labor market. Well, thank you very much for this clear definition of the different aspects in which university can contribute to. Another crucial element that has been mentioned today in order for us to face this important transformation, and it's related to finance. And I would like to ask a question to Mr. Andreu Mascolei in this sense. Aspect related to lifelong learning. How can administrations contribute to this training load by financing the offer so universities can develop more training, financing demand with bonuses for companies and other models that maybe you consider that should be taken into account? Well, thank you very much. Although it is desirable to place lifelong learning at the heart of the educational process and not at the periphery, we should start by saying that it's highly probable that this one cannot be financed the way we finance official studies at universities. It cannot be very much financed. It is also true that, as the minister pointed out, that we will generate an excess of capacity in the public university, but 20% of teachers cover one more course, and the productivity of this course can be increased by following online methods, maybe a couple of training courses, and I think that this would not be sufficient as a trend in whatever is going to be needed as permanent training. In any case, I think, we should be able to quantify and specify which is the ideal as far as lifelong training from a credit perspective. Credits provided beyond initial training. It's not the same if we aspire to 6 credits or 60 credits during lifelong learning. In any case, my hypothesis is that there would not be enough public resources to finance those courses, but I could say the same about the training related to international students. However, it is an obligation, a very good obligation, of welfare states, such as our welfare state, to provide for public resources dedicated to the task and also to finance these studies, at least partially. I would advise you to analyze those resources through students directly or through companies, which at the same time will turn them into finances for students, for training sessions. Direct, yes, but more in capital investment than current expenditure, more than the income. I think it's more convenient that this income comes from the users. I don't want to refine these ideas further. Let me reach the most important message that I want to communicate. Lifelong training is going to be in the hands of public or private universities. Of course, private ones are going to be there, and public ones won't be able to compete in prices. My hypothesis, not so much subsidies. So if we want public ones to become important actors, and I think the government has tried to do so, it is vital that the government remains obstacles introduced by their legislation as a result of mistrust, which can be overcome by their titles and the legal framework of the different centers. Whether you call them one thing or another, public universities can only compete with private ones in lifelong learning if they have the possibility to do it through instrumental entities of private law, whether you call them micro adscribe centers or no. The idea that these registered centers has to be a parasite is a mistake, and of course eliminates the possibilities of action of public universities in international lifelong learning. By the way, this is something that the university welcoming us understood very well 35 years ago. Let me also tell you that the different legislation of the law of universities, we have happily there to act in research. We still have to make some steps forward in the field of training in a project which is characterized by opening many doors and the prudence not to close them. It will be highly convenient not to close the door that we all want to open, to be more specific and a bit minimalist, maybe too specific, to open the possibility for public universities. We need draft law, at least in the Article 60 on foundations and other entities, and 62 on lack of compatibility. It will also be highly necessary to modify Article 97.5, reinforced by Law 97, or derogate the 13.6 of the Decree of Centers, limiting the offer of register or adscribe centers.
Gracias por esta concreción.
Thank you very much for being so specific. Well, sometimes you have to be specific, not only in the response, but also the content. If we continue with finance, I would like to ask Mr. Gutierrez, what can these employment services contribute with to bring lifelong learning? Well, this is going to help us to respond also to Andreu Mascuyer. Of course, we are, as we have said, modifying, well, not modifying, but creating a new training law, and something which is very clear and we have placed on the table. We have already circulated the text. We have incorporated them because we are aware of the fact that the framework under which vocational training dating from a law which is only 7 years old, the Royal Decree 30/2015 of the Popular Party, has become obsolete, not only because of the 7 years that have gone by. We have to open the framework to become more flexible. Legal instruments that we have in order to be able to collaborate within the framework of universities, and also finances. We have written it down. We have already painted it in the norms, and now it's going to be a second reading at the Council of Ministers, this law on employment, and I think that we have a second brilliant opportunity. Professional training, the one provided by university, is going to be part of the portfolio of the guarantee service of vocational training, and reinforces this. And one of the things that we're going to approve this year, we have to approve it because it's subject to the commitments that we have with the Commission. So this is something which is true. And we have established, among other things, 10 guarantee services to workers and 10 guarantee services to companies. Well, among them, those people working for the first time in this country, we have vocational training, of course, and no doubt training within the university umbrella will be part of this service, which will be also guaranteed. And in a transient way, we're also working on formulas. So this year, in collaboration with the Ministry of Education, we can start financing formula with the universities, together with individual permits. So during the year 2022, we can carry out some pilot projects of vocational training in the fieldwork of university, together with the same university, from a protocol of collaboration of the ministry and other universities that would like to join. Meanwhile, knowing that from January 2023, the law of employment and training in the labor market will enter into force, we'll have all the legal instruments, and we will constitute a task force in order to identify possible contents and fields of action. And this is why we want this program with different universities to have the most operational formula. And this is what we're working on. Very important from a finance perspective is that we are elaborating the different projects, operational projects, in the framework of the youth initiative, which, as you know, we are following. We're about to approve them, present them at the Commission to 2022-27, and we will also incorporate different initiatives in the subject we are dealing with. It's important to highlight this. And also in line with everything which is related to orientation and understanding and innovation, one of the investments that we have to make, public service of employment together with other is also executing, is the implementation of a network of centers of orientation, which will become the catalyzing point and the place where all the different institutions related to orientation and the service of orientation, lifelong, which is also related to the establishment of different people, will have this network in order to make it visible, make it in line, and also a training framework which is similar, which is also important, of the service of orientation through life, and also the services of orientation of the same universities. Of course, in order for this to be viable, universities, and this has been said by Ángel Pazos, have to modernize their administrative structures, because of course the framework is going to become more flexible, but the administrative framework of management will need some remodeling. Together with ACRUE, as you know, we have prepared some documents which are already circulating as a PowerPoint in order to train universities in the management of vocational training, something that has been highlighted by the president of ACRUE.
Bueno, pues muchas novedades.
Any novelties related to innovation. What you have mentioned as for the structure, it seems logic that the university has to update certain structures and infrastructures, also related to these tri-dimensional structures. The current model, which is very much centered in prioritizing the research, should be modified. How or what are the different aspects that the university should change in order to alter this incentive system of its staff? Question for Mr. Ángel Pazos. Well, of course, it's a question of incentivating. I've already said that the university is not going to change a specific radar unless there is a policy of incentives and restructuring. You were saying that the university is oriented mainly towards research. If this roundtable had happened 30 years ago, you would have said that the university is oriented mainly in awareness or regulated awareness. What did it change? Well, unless from top down is the ministry. It changed because there was a decision that the university had to carry out research. We understood that the university which is not teaching is not a university, and a university which does teaching but not research is a bad university. This was understood like this. Finance, and then this structure was created. We will need another roundtable to explain it, and this is why we can say that the professional career in university is very much determined by not only teaching but research. If we now want to add lifelong learning to this equation, we will have to create universities internally when it comes to evaluate and value our people. But of course, agencies evaluating will have to place in this cocktail of merits to promote themselves lifelong learning. And this is something which has consequences on our own university. It has also consequences on the ministry, knowing that he's here frontline, we shoot at him, and it also affects the evaluation agencies. So to change the incentive model and say that one of the things that has to be evaluated in the activity of the teachers and personnel will be to dedicate themselves to permanent training, and not like now. We also have to incentivize the institution as such. As Gerardo was saying, we have been working together with CRUE in our titles, teaching, research. We have elaborated a guideline in order to incentivize the participation of universities in lifelong learning related to employment. And we should continue working on this path. I have already mentioned the need to modulate management. And I want to go back to what the moderator was saying and Andrea was saying. This has two meanings: change of mindset and finances. So first of all, we should not get out of here saying we're going to change the mindset, infrastructure, etc. This is at a price which will be paid either by the public administration or the private sector or everything. But this is a key element. And something else. We've said that at the beginning, opening session, we have to democratize lifelong learning. And of course, prices of our degrees are not the official ones. If we want this to change, we will have to change the system. Besides the management, as Andrea was saying, public management is not the ideal one. But someone will have to place this on the table. Therefore, to incentivize the staff, and this means that in their processes of evaluation of lifelong learning is going to be a key aspect to incentivize management and to change the structure of priorities of the universities and also better finance. I think it's a complicated cocktail, but a possible one. And some strides have been made, difficult ones, and they seem almost impossible 30 or 40 years ago. Well, thank you very much. Many changes. As far as the structure that should be applied to these modules of vocational training, and this is a question for Mr. Andreu Masculei. Do you think that these different models should provide a more standardized offer? Or to become more flexible, or maybe more subject to creativity? What will be the fair point to strike?
Gracias. En fin, yo pienso que...
Thank you. Well, I believe it's not desirable to regulate in a vacuum. So I would never invest too many resources in one same program or qualification, and also I would avoid an isolated pilot project, because oftentimes we end up postponing large investments, and when we want to postpone a large investment, we launch a pilot project to keep the waters calm, so to speak. So we are lucky that we have the next generation funds, but of course they will last for a short period of time, and I believe now it's about to invest what really takes, and we have to launch parallel or simultaneously several pilot projects aligned with up-to-date social science methodologies. We need to assess the experiment in its globality with a randomized design component in order to benchmark between experiences, and from there on move on, not to homogenize, but rather to get rid of what is not working. This is what the JPAL in the MIT are doing in poverty eradication programs, or in London in order to promote innovation. Thank you very much. We are getting to the end of the panel discussion. We need to tackle equality of opportunities, because we are dealing with education, right? This is a question for Madame Alesson and for Mr. Gutierrez. For Marian Alesson, now regarding equality of opportunities, oftentimes people with more qualifications are the ones that end up being qualified the most, and the ones with less qualifications at departure are the ones that obtain less qualifications. So how shall processes be oriented, and how can we prevent such risk? I agree with you. It's fundamental and it's a very important and real challenge. When you want to enhance IT and fight against a digital gap, it's not about launching an online survey. We leave so many people behind if we do so. If we want to make sure that education is democratic, inclusive, and truthful, we need to bear in mind all these elements. Who are we targeting? How are we answering to different students' profiles? Now, to cut a long story short, I would like to speak about 3 profiles. Those who already have a certificate, but who want to obtain further qualifications, but they know what they want. And these ones are not worrying us because they know what they want. Then we have professionals working in companies, and companies tell them about their needs. They tell them, you need to get training on this. Say, a food company who has an engineer and enrolls him in a Master's in Business Administration, an MBA. This does not concern us much either. The problem is those who are unemployed over 50 years. They need extra training and they don't know what to do. And there we need advice. We need to come up with an answer with orientation programs, because of course the training for this target has to be discontinuous. It cannot be closed, and it requires of a training. Universities have orientation departments that will have to be updated and able to respond to these needs. But of course, funding is very important. Let me go back to the ministry. Funding is very important. We need funding because university is expensive, right? Professionals working in universities need their salaries, right? And the responsibility to train people lays at the level of public universities, because oftentimes our target audience cannot have access to training through the private market. So we need to find funding schemes to respond to this social need. Thank you very much. Now for Mr. Gerardo Gutierrez, as regarding less qualified workers, those working in small and medium-sized enterprises, how can we engage them? How can we attract them towards lifelong learning? Of course, in Spain, 47% of small and medium-sized enterprises don't know about the idea of lifelong learning. They are not, let's say, attracted to lifelong learning. So it's all about awareness raising. Thanks to the new regulation that has been approved at the labor market level, we're going to be asking small and medium-sized companies to facilitate training in their field of operation, but with a lack of rigidity, or with a more flexible approach in terms of certification, because the small and medium-sized companies oftentimes cannot implement such training. So we're going to come up with a plan to ease this process. Then there is a matter of responsibility. Large companies, big companies, we have a few in the country, they need to attract small and medium-sized companies. There are some interesting examples from the last 2 years in what we call the digitalisation plus, because there is a second edition or version of the project, of the platform. We're speaking about a PPP, one of the most important ones in terms of digital skills, and very large technological corporations are attracting SMEs. So there we have an important task ahead. small and large companies need to become learning centers. Thank you. Now, to conclude, last question, there's another topic that has been raised. Online, face-to-face, where do you think universities should play the match? Online or in the room? The digital transformation offers incredible opportunities. We are all assessing them, not so much only in terms of training per se or education per se, but also in terms of management. Before I referred to the challenges we face in terms of the internationalization and Europeization of our qualifications now, or certification processes. Regarding the format, I believe we need to find the right balance. Online training will play its part, of course, because in many circumstances it will be the only possible alternative for recipients, right? Because it will reach more people, geographically speaking. Also because some people cannot attend university because they work. So I believe that online teaching will be important in the future. But of course, I would not like to be rigid here. I was thinking about the JOSEPE working group with the 7 different training blocks. And I recall there is one, the training leave, of course, in other cases, we need university consortiums and online learning. So I would be flexible. I would say that online teaching will be important, but of course we'll need also hybrid formats depending on the subject, depending on the recipients. So if you have a recipient, a target recipient with a university background, you're in one scenario, but, well, there's another challenge, which is attracting university naive, let's say, recipients. So I believe we'll need to find the right balance between face-to-face and online training. As a rector, I cannot close this session without saying the following. No matter what we do, in the area of lifelong learning, it doesn't matter if we're targeting the senior or if we are operating through MOOCs or executive education. We shall never forget the main purpose of education, which is training or educating our citizens better in order to build up a critical view on the topics we deal with, on all topics actually. So, yeah, thank you very much. Excellent conclusion. So this is the end of the panel discussion. Raul, do we have time for a Q&A or should we leave it here? Thank you very much to all of you. We are extremely late. We're running very, very late. But if you have any very short, urgent question, do not hesitate to ask it now.
Hola, buenos días. Soy María Cristina.
Hello, my name is Maria Cristina Sand, and I am the president of RPEP, the University Network of Long Life Learning. My question or my thoughts are for the FEPE director. So, we have been interacting with you a great deal with Mano Menendez. Actually, he's our focal point, and we have an agreement with Fundae, a collaboration agreement with Fundae. We have perceived a great deal of will to allow universities to participate, but you are not making things easy to us. Oftentimes we've had Fundae trainings or sessions, but such trainings are focused on your rules of the game. And in a marriage, you need to find the right balance. That's the only thing I wanted to say, and not impose your thoughts on others. And I have the feeling sometimes you impose your thoughts on us, or your approach on us. Absolutely. That's why we need to update our legal framework. We need to open our legal framework as of January the 1st, 2023. And the legal framework, the new legal framework, will be much more flexible. Okay, we are going to close this panel discussion here. I would like to give a clap to all the speakers. And we'll now move on to the closing remarks. I would like to introduce and thank Mr. Pingarron, Secretary General of Universities and President of the Spanish Service for the Internationalization of Education of the Ministry of Universities. Thanks for being here, Secretary General, and I believe that his closing observations will be extremely interesting. I would like to thank you all for being here, and thanks for following us online. Thank you very much indeed. Now, closing remarks by the Secretary General for Universities of the Spanish Government.
Bueno, pues buenos días a todas y todos.
Good morning, good afternoon, one and all. Instead of sharing my closing remarks, I should perhaps share a lecture with you. I'm not going to do it. I would like to start by thanking you all the speakers, all the volunteer students who helped us organize this session, and I would like to share a couple of thoughts with you. First, this is a pathway. This is a new pathway, but as many rectors said, universities have already a certain experience, right? So the university in-house qualifications are a good start for all universities. That there are perfectly organized services. So we have new challenges ahead, of course, in terms of professional qualifications, micro-credentials, and I would like to share two remarks with you. One, no matter what learning modality you want to come up with, you will need to fulfill some criteria, and the first one is quality. And this is the mantra of universities, both public and private, quality. And quality needs to be granted by rating agencies and all agencies in charge of ensuring quality. That's why the European research that the Commission is promoting is so important. The research is, of course, about micro-credentials quality guarantees. You know perfectly that today we have a regulation according to which we need a stamp, a quality stamp issued by universities, and stamps need to be approved by executive boards. Our trainings need to be, or will be, quality trainings. And of course this will entail differences between universities. We need to be relevant and aligned with the demand. Now, regarding funding, many rectors know it. From the ministry, we have urged the President's Economic Office to act as to obtain European funds, gather European funds in order to finance companies and universities so that we can find the right balance between offer and demand. And at the same time, we need to ensure that we can come up with pilot projects that will allow us to move towards the use and the design of micro-credentials. So, from the Ministry, we are 100% aligned. I wouldn't say this is a new mission in universities. We're speaking about the mission of servicing society. Now, the boundaries or the limits of your mandate are broader and broader. Before, the rector, Mr. Pathos, referred to the situation 30 years ago. Of course, we don't want to go back to 30 years. We want to broaden our scope. We want to broaden our mandate. Knowledge transfer, long life learning, and more to come. And for that, of course, we'll need funding and we'll need a change in universities' structure, but we want to broaden our mandate. And of course, the ministry is here to support you, to guide you in the pathway. Don't doubt it. We are at your entire disposal. Let me conclude by once again thanking you warmly for your participation. The Ministry of Universities has taken note of your remarks. Professor Mascolel referred to the modification of some articles of the draft lawsuit bill, something that has been debated previously with public and private foundations. This is a legal debate, but we have taken due note of Professor's remarks to make the process as flexible as possible, to make university structures as flexible as possible without losing track of quality. We shall always avoid competing, but rather working as private universities are doing, which is the path we all need to walk together. So, once again, thank you very much to all of you. It's been a pleasure and an honor, and we'll be in touch throughout the week, because we are in the week of higher education, a fascinating week. Thanks.